Before there was Capone carving up Chicago into territories. Before Lucky Luciano sat 5 families down at a table and divided New York like a pie. Before any of that, there was a farmer's son from North Carolina who did something no gangster in American history would ever manage. He didn't just take over a neighborhood or a city or even a state. He took over 90% of an entire national industry. And he did it legally, on paper, with contracts instead of contracts on people's lives. Before we get into how one family quietly bought a piece of every cigarette smoked in America, hit subscribe to Brand Ancestry and turn on notifications, because this is where the real brand gets exposed, the ones that never needed a gun, a badge, or a headline to run the world. If you like uncovering the syndicate's history tried to dress up as business, you're exactly where you need to be. Now let's get into it. By the year 1900, one company controlled roughly 90 cents of every single dollar spent on tobacco in the United States. Cigarettes, cigars, snuff, chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco. Every region, every market, from the tenements of New York to the dry goods stores of the rural South. And here's the part that should stop you cold. In the 10 years it took to build that empire, this company didn't grow by innovation alone. It grew by devouring roughly 250 competing businesses. Some it bought outright, cash on the table, a handshake and a signature. Some it strangled slowly, cutting prices below cost in their own backyard, until they bled out and begged to be purchased for scraps. And some, this is the part that sounds less like capitalism and more like a mob hit, some it bought for the sole purpose of shutting them down. Not to run them, not to expand them, just to kill them and remove them permanently from the board. By 1911, this operation was worth over $300 million. To put that in perspective, in the entire history of American industry up to that point, there were only 2 enterprises on the planet bigger than it, Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. That's the company this man built. And the man himself? He had no college degree. He'd spent, by generous estimate, about 8 months of his entire life sitting in a classroom. He started working the family business at 15 years old, sweeping tobacco dust off the floor of a small factory in Durham, North Carolina. And somewhere between that dusty factory floor and the presidency of one of the largest monopolies the world had ever seen, he built something that operated less like a corporation and more like a criminal syndicate, wearing a suit and tie. Secret deals competitors never saw. Manufactured competition that didn't actually exist. Violence out in the countryside when farmers finally understood what was being done to them. And when the full weight of the United States government finally came down on him, when the Supreme Court itself ordered his empire dismantled, he walked away from the wreckage richer than when the whole thing started. His name was James Buchanan Duke, and to understand how a man like that gets built, you have to go back further than him. You have to go back to his father and to a lie the family told about itself for 100 years, a lie that was almost, but not quite, true. The story the Duke family loved to tell, the one printed in newspapers and repeated in polite company for generations, went something like this. A defeated Confederate soldier, a broken man in a broken country, walks 135 miles home from a Yankee prison with nothing in his pockets but 50 cents, leading a blind mule, and from those ashes, through nothing but grit and Methodist faith, builds one of the great fortunes of American history. It's a beautiful story. It is the kind of story empires like to tell about themselves. And like most stories empires tell about themselves, it's been sanded down, polished, and quietly edited to remove the parts that don't flatter anybody. Washington Duke was born in December of 1820, the 8th child of dirt-poor farmers in Orange County, North Carolina, on a stretch of red clay that grew corn, hogs, and a little bit of tobacco. He never spent a full year of his life inside a schoolhouse. He taught himself to read by lamplight. He married young, buried that wife early, remarried a woman named Artelia, and then, in 1858, tragedy hit the family twice in 10 days. His son and his second wife both came down with typhoid. The boy died first. His mother, who'd caught the fever nursing him back, followed him into the ground before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Washington Duke never remarried. He was left with 4 surviving children and a farm, and a country that was about to tear itself apart. In 1864, with the Confederacy so desperate for soldiers it was now conscripting men in their 40s, Washington Duke, 43 years old, and by every account a man with no enthusiasm left for a war he'd never wanted, was pulled into the Confederate Navy. And here's where you start to see the instincts that would define the next 60 years of his family's fortune. Before he reported for duty, he didn't just abandon the farm. He liquidated it. He sold off the equipment, took the cash, and converted every dollar into cured tobacco leaf, a commodity, unlike Confederate paper money, that he correctly guessed would still be worth something when the shooting stopped. He hid that leaf. He sent his younger children to live with relatives where they'd be safer, and then he went off to serve on a Confederate vessel, was captured by Union forces near the war's brutal final chapter, and spent its last weeks locked inside Libby Prison, a converted Richmond warehouse crammed with prisoners of every rank as the entire Confederacy collapsed in on itself around them. When the war finally ended in April of 1865, the federal government released him at New Bern on the North Carolina coast, 135 miles from home, in a country that no longer legally recognized anything he owned. No horse, no money, no transportation of any kind. Just a long walk through a devastated, occupied southern landscape, back toward a farm he had no idea was even still standing. That much of the legend is true. He really did walk home. But everything after that moment has been shined up for public consumption. The 50 cents? No contemporary source for it exists anywhere in the record. The tobacco leaf he'd hidden before leaving, the thing that actually saved his family, barely gets a mention in the popular version because shrewd financial planning doesn't make as good a bedtime story as A Man and a Blind Mule. And that mule? There were actually 2 of them, blind, and they don't even show up in the record at the moment of homecoming. They appear months later on the first sales trip, harnessed to what family papers describe only as a broken-down wagon. Here is what actually happened, stripped of a century of polish. Washington Duke came home to a ransacked farm, dug up the tobacco leaf he'd buried before the war, and inside a 16 by 8-foot log corn crib, a structure barely bigger than a modern bedroom, he and his surviving children cured it, beat it, sifted it, and packed it by hand into cloth sacks. He stamped those sacks with a brand name that, given everything we now know about how this family made its money, reads almost like a joke played by history itself: pro bono publico, Latin for the public good. Within a year, that tiny one-room operation was turning out roughly 15,000 pounds of smoking tobacco annually. And the proceeds from that very first sales trip, the one with the 2 blind mules and the broken-down wagon, went toward lard, bacon, and a single bucket of sugar, which, in that household, counted as pure luxury. But here's the part of the founding myth the Duke family spent 100 years trying very hard not to talk about. The story they told cast Washington Duke as a humble yeoman farmer who'd never had any use for slavery, a man who worked his own land with his own 2 hands, morally untouched by the South's original sin. The documents tell a different story. In October of 1855, 9 years before the war ever took him away, Washington Duke walked into an estate auction in Orange County and purchased a human being, an enslaved girl named Caroline, approximately 11 or 12 years old. She lived in the Duke household, performing domestic labor and farm work for years. And in 1863, in the middle of the war itself, Duke entered into a formal contract with a Lenoir County planter named James Cox, leasing the labor of an enslaved man named Jim for a full year. Jim was, in the strict legal sense of that horrifying era, owned by one man and worked by another simultaneously. And twice during that single year of forced labor, Jim ran. He escaped the Duke property not once, but twice, acts of resistance that survive today, only because Cox happened to write about the inconvenience in letters that are now preserved in university archives. The Duke homestead's own historical materials described Washington for decades as a man who ran his farm without the benefit of slaves. Historians have since gone back and corrected the record. Plainly, and without much room for interpretation. The fortune that would eventually build a university, a power company, and one of the largest personal estates in American history had its very first foundation stones laid, at least in part, on land worked by people who were never paid a cent and never asked for their labor at all. By 1874, Washington had grown the business enough to move the whole operation into the young railroad town of Durham, buying 2 acres of land right next to the tracks. In 1878, a Baltimore businessman named George Watts bought a 1/5 stake in the company for $14,000, and the firm was renamed W. Duke, Sons and Company. And by around 1880, Washington, now pushing 60, his health beginning to slow him down, started stepping back from daily management, handing the wheel to his sons and spending the remaining quarter-century of his life on the Methodist Church, Republican politics in a region that despised Republicans, and a surprising amount of philanthropy for a man of his era, including funding one of the first hospitals for African Americans in Durham. He died in 1905 at 84 years old, having started life on a dirt floor and ended it as the patriarch of a trust that controlled 90% of American tobacco production. He had, quite literally, walked home from nothing, and his children would spend the rest of the century making sure everyone remembered that walk, while making very sure nobody remembered the auction or the contract, or the man named Jim who tried twice to run. Washington raised 3 sons who lived long enough to inherit what he'd built, and if you want to understand how empires actually function once the founder steps aside, you need to understand these 3 men, because they are, in miniature, the entire story of what happens to a family fortune once the money starts flowing. One brother destroyed himself. One brother held everything together in silence, and one brother became a monster of pure ambition, the likes of which the tobacco business, and honestly most of American industry, had never quite seen before. The eldest, Brodie Leonidas Duke, was the first of the family to set up shop in downtown Durham, arriving there in 1869, years ahead of his father and younger brothers, and by 1878 he'd built one of the oldest surviving tobacco warehouses in the city. He had real entrepreneurial instinct. He understood the leaf trade as well as anyone in the family. What he didn't have was the ability to stay sober long enough to capitalize on any of it. By the early 1890s, his drinking had become the kind of problem that couldn't be hidden from Durham society anymore, and he traveled all the way to Illinois to undergo something called the Keeley Cure, the most heavily advertised alcoholism treatment of the era, which involved injecting patients with a supposed miracle formula the Keeley Institutes marketed as bichloride of gold. It didn't work, not really. Brodie came back to Durham looking sober. Within 3 years, he'd declared bankruptcy, and his younger brother had to step in and take over his mills. He relapsed. And in what might be the single most petty and revealing act in the entire Duke family record, when Brodie acquired 3 parcels of land in downtown Durham and laid out new streets running through them, he named them, in order, so that anyone reading a city map from east to west would read the message loud and clear. Washington. Hated. Watts. Read together. Washington Duke hated Watts, a permanent public cartographic temper tantrum aimed at his own father's business partner. The city of Durham eventually decided that naming a public street after a raw emotion was a little too undignified, and quietly renamed Hated Street to Gregson Street in 1902. Brodie cycled through several more bankruptcies after that and died in 1919 at 72, the family's cautionary tale, the one relative nobody quite wanted to talk about at Thanksgiving. The middle brother, Benjamin, Newton Duke, was the opposite in almost every way, and if Brodie was the family's public embarrassment, Benjamin was its quiet, indispensable engine. He served as vice president of the American Tobacco Company from the day it was founded in 1890 until the day the federal government tore it apart in 1911, and in between, he was the one managing the actual relationships with banks, with railroads, with the sprawling textile and utility interests the family kept adding to its portfolio. He sat on Trinity College's Board of Trustees, starting in 1887, and quietly funded the institution for 40 straight years without ever needing his name on a building. He personally gave to black institutions across the Jim Crow South, hospitals, colleges, at a time when very few white businessmen of his standing bothered. He ran the back office of one of the largest fortunes in American history for nearly half a century, and he never once became the face of any of it. That role belonged entirely to his younger brother. Because the youngest son, born December 23, 1856, and nicknamed Buck since he was old enough to answer to it, was a different species of businessman entirely. James Buchanan Duke's formal education amounted to a scattering of local academies, a short stint at a school in Greensboro, and a few months at a business college in Poughkeepsie, New York, where he learned bookkeeping. That was it. That was the entire academic preparation of a man who would go on to outmaneuver some of the sharpest business minds in the country. He never enrolled in a university. He never even tried. By 15, he was working the family operation full-time, hauling tobacco, loading wagons, riding the rural sales circuit alongside his father, learning the business from the ground up in a way no amount of classroom instruction could have taught him. What people who actually knew him noticed again and again was what wasn't there. He didn't flirt. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't collect art, throw parties, or cultivate any interest whatsoever outside of tobacco and later electricity. He smoked constantly and wore the same suits until they were falling apart at the seams, not out of poverty, but because he genuinely didn't care. His idea of a motivational speech to new employees, according to his own attorney, was a single sentence. "Don't ask me to raise your salary. I always know what my people are worth to me, and I pay them what they are worth without being asked." One historian who spent a career studying him called him an extremely keen judge of men. Their character, their ability, and by clear implication, their weaknesses. His biographer, writing decades later, put it more bluntly. "The story of a monopolist," he wrote, "is bound to be the story of a ruthless man." And Duke himself apparently didn't mind the comparison people constantly made between him and John D. Rockefeller, because the methods really were nearly identical. The secret pricing deals nobody else knew about, the predatory acquisitions dressed up as friendly mergers, the deliberate destruction of a competitor's ability to produce anything at all, the eventual inevitable collision with federal antitrust law, and at the very end, the late-life transformation into a beloved philanthropist, as if 40 years of financial warfare could be quietly absolved by a university building with your name on it. By his early 20s, working the Durham factory floor alongside his father and brothers, James had already run the numbers on the family's biggest problem and concluded something his father didn't want to hear. They could not win the fight they were currently fighting. The dominant smoking tobacco brand in America at that time was Bull D. Urham, made by a rival firm that had locked up the loose-leaf tobacco market through brand recognition and advertising spend. The Dukes simply couldn't match, dollar for dollar. James's response to this, preserved in family accounts, was ice-cold and utterly characteristic of the man he would become. "My company is up against a stone wall. It can't compete with Bull Durham. Something has to be done, and that quick. I am going into the cigarette business." It wasn't inspiration. It wasn't vision. It was a man looking at a map, realizing he couldn't punch through a wall, and deciding to walk around it instead. And the wall he walked around turned out to be one of the great missed opportunities in the history of American industry, a mistake made by someone else that James B. Duke would spend the rest of his career exploiting. In the 1870s, cigarette manufacturing depended entirely on human hands. An expert roller, almost always an immigrant woman working a factory floor in Richmond or New York, could produce roughly 4 cigarettes a minute. That was the ceiling. That was the bottleneck strangling the entire industry's growth. In 1875, the largest cigarette manufacturer in the country, desperate to break through that ceiling, posted a $75,000 prize for any inventor who could build a working cigarette rolling machine. A young man named James Albert Bonsack took up the challenge. Barely into his 20s, working with $50 borrowed from his grandmother, he designed a machine that could ultimately produce 200 cigarettes a minute, a 50-fold improvement over the fastest human hands alive. He patented it in 1881, refined it further, and by 1883 had founded his own machine company to license the invention out. And here's where the story takes the turn that changes everything. The very company that had sponsored the $75,000 prize, the one whose engineers had inspired Bonsak's invention in the first place, tested the machine, ran consumer surveys, and concluded that smokers would never accept a machine-rolled cigarette. They believed hand-rolled would always carry the market premium. They passed. Business historians who've studied the decision since consider it one of the single costliest mistakes of the entire 19th century in American industry. James B. Duke, 27 years old in 1883, looked at the exact same machine and made the opposite bet, against the open skepticism of his own father and partners, who viewed cigarettes as a passing fad. In April of 1884, he installed the first Bonsack machine in his Durham factory, and the contract he negotiated to get it, this is the hinge point, the single deal on which an entire empire would eventually be built, was kept secret from every other manufacturer in the country. The standard royalty Bonsack charged other licensees was 30 cents per 1,000 cigarettes produced. Duke negotiated a private rate of 20 cents per 1,000, a full third cheaper, in exchange for committing to use Bonsack machines exclusively. He went further still, hiring one of Bonsack's own mechanics to live in Durham full-time, just to keep his machines running with an uptime no competitor using the same technology could match. Nobody else in the industry knew the terms of that deal existed. The math that followed was devastating. Within 4 years, Duke had laid off every single hand roller in his operation. The labor cost of producing 1,000 cigarettes, which had sat at 96 cents in 1876, collapsed to roughly 8 cents by 1895, an 87% reduction. Layer his secret royalty discount onto P of that, and the result was a cost structure no honest competitor could touch. Every 1,000 cigarettes Duke produced cost him 10 cents less in royalties alone than the same 1,000 cost anyone else using the identical machine, before either man had even paid for tobacco, packaging, or advertising. It meant Duke could slash his prices below what his rivals needed just to break even and still turn a profit while doing it. And then, with the money he was saving, he opened up a second front entirely: advertising. In 1889 alone, his company spent $800,000 on marketing, roughly $25 million in today's money, flooding the country with collectible trading cards tucked into cigarette packs, sponsoring a bizarre touring polo team that played the sport on roller skates, buying up entire sections of newspapers in cities his rivals had once considered untouchable territory. By 1889, his factories were turning out 834 million cigarettes a year, and he controlled 38% of the entire American cigarette market. He was 32 years old. It's worth pausing on Bonsack himself for a moment, because his story is the quiet tragedy tucked inside this one. Nobody knows exactly when he discovered that his biggest customer had been secretly paying a third less than everybody else. What the record does show is that the arrangement only became public more than 20 years later, when federal investigators pulled the actual contract documents into evidence during the antitrust trial. By then, Bonsack was long out of active management of his own company. He died in 1924 with a comfortable, unspectacular fortune. The man who'd used his invention to build a monopoly was, by that same year, sitting on a personal estate the New York Times would soon value at over $100 million. One man built the machine. The other man built the empire on top of it, and the difference between them was 10 cents and a secret. By 1890, after 18 months of brutal price warfare that was bleeding every major cigarette manufacturer in the country dry, the 5 biggest players in the industry sat down and did something that should sound very familiar if you've ever watched a movie about organized crime bosses carving up territory to stop killing each other. They merged. On January 31st, 1890, W. Duke Sons and Company joined with 4 of its largest rivals, companies Duke had spent years at war with, to form the American Tobacco Company. James B. Duke, 33 years old, became president. His 4 merger partners, several of them older men who had once been his direct targets, went along with the arrangement because they understood a simple truth. Continuing to fight him would cost them more than surrendering to him. The new trust controlled roughly 40% of the American cigarette market on day one. That number would not stay at 40% for long. Starting in 1895, American tobacco began expanding into every adjacent corner of the tobacco business: plug tobacco, snuff, pipe tobacco, cigars, none of which had been Duke's original territory. And the method, documented later in exhaustive detail during the federal antitrust trial, was almost mechanical in its repetition. Identify a healthy independent competitor, launch a fighting brand in that competitor's own strongest market, priced deliberately below cost, a loss the trust could absorb for years, but the smaller company couldn't survive for months, wait for the independent to go bankrupt or come crawling for a buyout, acquire them at a fraction of their real value, often attaching a non-compete clause that legally barred the previous owner from ever entering the business again. And then, in many cases, simply shut the factory down, not to run it, not to absorb its production, but purely to remove the capacity from the market entirely. The Supreme Court would later describe this practice in language that reads less like a legal opinion and more like an indictment of organized crime. Plants, the court wrote, were purchased not for the purpose of utilizing them, but in order to close them up and render them useless for the purposes of trade. The most brutal application of this formula became known as the plug war of the mid-1890s, a deliberate, calculated campaign to dominate the chewing tobacco market, the single largest tobacco category in the country at the time. According to federal calculations made afterward, the trust intentionally absorbed losses of between $3.5 and $4 million, purely to bankrupt independent chewing tobacco manufacturers who dared compete in markets American tobacco wanted for itself. The rival brands that sprang up in defense had names that, in hindsight, read like a declaration of war: scalping knife, crossbow. It didn't matter. One by one, the independents fell. Drummond Tobacco was acquired in 1898 for over $3 million. Others followed through similar arrangements. Even Blackwell's Durham Tobacco Company, the very maker of Bull Durham, the brand that had once locked James B. Duke out of the loose-leaf market and forced him into cigarettes in the first place, was eventually swallowed whole. By the time the dust settled, the consolidation had consumed roughly 250 separate companies. And here's the part that made the whole thing feel less like a business trust and more like an elaborate con being run on the entire American consumer base. Many of these newly absorbed companies kept operating under their original brand names. Shoppers walking into a general store believed they were choosing between competing products from competing companies. In reality, they were often choosing between different brands owned by the exact same trust. A structure the Supreme Court would later brand, in its own words, bogus independence. A manufactured illusion of competition, sold to the public as the real thing. Duke didn't stop at the water's edge either. In 1901, he traveled to England with $30 million, intending to buy up British tobacco firms one by one, the exact same way he'd done in America. This time, the British saw him coming. 13 tobacco companies banded together defensively, forming the Imperial Tobacco Company of Great Britain and Ireland, specifically to keep him out. A direct mirror of the very merger Duke himself had orchestrated back in 1890. Imperial then threatened to invade the American market right back. After 2 years of genuine transatlantic commercial warfare, the two sides blinked, called a truce in 1902, and formed a joint venture to split the rest of the world between them. The British-American Tobacco Company. Duke became its first chairman. Over the following decades, that company would operate in Canada, China, Germany, Australia, South Africa, and dozens of other countries, becoming the first true global tobacco multinational on Earth. Back home, by 1904, American Tobacco's capitalization stood at over $235 million. By 1911, total equity would top $300 million, putting Duke's creation roughly on par with the two largest industrial trusts in American history. But behind the NHUs, Umbers, Inside the actual Durham factories producing all those cigarettes, there was a hierarchy just as rigid and deliberate as anything in the boardroom. White men operated the machinery and held every supervisory and mechanical position. White women, dressed in clean white uniforms, worked the packing floor in the best-lit, best-ventilated rooms in the building. Black men were assigned the heaviest labor in the leaf department, the dustiest, most punishing stage of production. Black women worked the stemmery, stripping the central vein out of every single tobacco leaf by hand, in what former workers themselves described as the hottest, dirtiest job in the entire operation. White workers ate lunch inside, in a company cafeteria. Black workers ate lunch out on the street. White supervisors wouldn't even extend black women the basic courtesy titles of Miss or Mrs. Interestingly, the Dukes built an almost gentle paternalistic system for their mostly white textile mill workers elsewhere, company housing, churches, recreation halls, all deliberately designed to keep those workers content and far away from labor organizers. No version of that same care extended to the black men and women running the tobacco floor in Durham. They got none of the housing, none of the protection, and all of the hierarchy. And out in the actual tobacco country, the farms of Kentucky and Tennessee where the raw leaf was grown, Duke's monopoly had squeezed the growers themselves for years. As the sole major buyer at auction, the trust could simply dictate what it paid for a farmer's entire year of labor, and there was nowhere else to sell. By 1906, the anger finally exploded into open violence. Farmers organized into a group called the Planters Protective Association, and in a campaign historians now call the Black Patch Tobacco Wars, began burning the trust's warehouses to the ground. This wasn't a labor strike. This was arson, organized and repeated, aimed directly at the physical infrastructure of the company that had been quietly strangling their livelihoods for a decade. It is, in its own way, the clearest sign of how deep this monopoly's grip had reached, deep enough that the people growing its raw material were willing to burn buildings down in retaliation. The federal government had been circling the tobacco trust for years by that point, but it was only in July of 1907, after one of the trust's subsidiaries was indicted separately for price fixing, that the Department of Justice finally filed a full antitrust petition against the entire combination. 65 companies, 29 individuals, including James Buchanan Duke, his brother Benjamin, and their longtime partner George Watts. The case would become one of the most exhaustively documented antitrust proceedings in American history, running in parallel with the equally massive case against Standard Oil. The trial began in 1908. By then, Duke, 51 years old, suffering from pernicious anemia, a condition that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was too ill to appear in the courtroom. Picture this for a moment. Attorneys and stenographers crowded into the bedroom of his Fifth Avenue mansion, taking sworn testimony from a man too sick to sit up in a courtroom chair, while outside, federal prosecutors were building the most detailed paper trail ever assembled against an American monopoly. Duke's testimony tried to pin the blame for the brutal plug war entirely on a rival company, claiming they'd started the price war first. The court wasn't buying it. There was simply too much documentary evidence, internal letters, acquisition contracts, government pricing reports, for the finger-pointing to matter much anymore. In November of 1908, the Circuit Court ruled against American Tobacco. And the reasoning behind that ruling is one of the strangest, most fascinating footnotes in the entire case. The judge openly acknowledged that there was no clear evidence the trust had actually raised prices on consumers, restricted overall supply, or directly harmed ordinary buyers. By the standards most people would use to judge whether a monopoly is bad, this one hadn't obviously hurt the public at the register, but the court found it guilty anyway, because the very act of merging and absorbing all those competitors had itself eliminated competition that used to exist. Size wasn't the crime. The act of combining was the crime. American Tobacco appealed, and the case landed before the Supreme Court in 1910. On May 29, 1911, The exact same day the court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil, it handed down its ruling on American tobacco. Chief Justice Edward White, writing both opinions on the very same morning, applied what he called the rule of reason. Not every business practice that restrained trade was illegal, only the unreasonable ones. And when the court looked at American tobacco's history as a whole, it found the entire pattern to be exactly that: unreasonable, deliberate, and designed from the start to monopolize an entire industry. The justices called out the specific tactics by name: the original wave of buyouts, the below-cost pricing wars used to strangle plug tobacco competitors, the secret agreements and fake independent brands used to hide the trust's true reach, the plants bought purely to be shuttered, and the web of non-compete agreements binding former rivals into permanent silence. The court ordered the trust broken into 16 separate companies. And here is the twist that should genuinely astonish you if you've never heard this story before. It didn't hurt Duke at all. His personal shares in the old trust were simply redistributed proportionally across all 16 new companies, which then began competing with each other in ways the old trust's internal coordination had never allowed. Freed from the constraints of operating as one giant, slow-moving monopoly, the biggest successor companies threw themselves into marketing and expansion with a hunger the trust had never needed to show. Within a few years, the combined market value of those 16 companies actually exceeded what the original trust had been worth. Duke's personal fortune, estimated at roughly $150 million by 1916, was larger after the government tore his empire apart than I had been before. The law had broken the monopoly. The math had made the man richer. And by 1911, at 54 years old, having worked in tobacco continuously since he was 15, James B. Duke simply turned his attention to something else entirely, as if the destruction of everything he'd spent 30 years building was little more than a mild inconvenience on the way to his next project. His personal life, in the meantime, had already produced its own quiet tragedy, one that unfolded almost entirely outside the public glare of the antitrust case, and reads, honestly, like something out of a noir film. In 1904, at 47 years old, one of the richest men in America, having remained a bachelor through his entire rise to power, Duke suddenly and quickly became engaged to a twice-married New York socialite named Lillian Macready. The wedding was small, rushed, held in New Jersey, and the couple sailed for Europe within days. But the marriage was already rotting from the inside. According to evidence that would later surface in divorce proceedings, Lillian had been writing letters from European hotels to a New York National Guard officer named Frank Hahn, a man the papers politely described as well known as a man about town. The correspondence didn't stop when the couple returned home. Duke's suspicions hardened into certainty, and he did what a man of his resources and temperament would do. He hired private detectives to follow his own wife. What they found was, in his lawyer's eyes, conclusive. In September of 1905, the New York Times ran the headline, "James B. Duke sues wife for divorce, names Frank T. Horner." The case dragged through 1905 and into 1906, Lillian firing back with her own accusations of cruelty, before the divorce was finalized in May of 1906. She walked away with a settlement of $500,000, a figure one contemporary source, Dr. Ely, called paltry, against a fortune estimated at $60 million. What happened to Lillian after that is one of the genuinely haunting footnotes in this entire empire's history. She tried to rebuild a life around music, studying singing, eventually supporting herself as a piano and voice teacher, working out of a small studio, teaching by 1925 only 2 students. And then, 20 years after the divorce, in March of 1925, she suddenly filed suit to have the entire divorce declared invalid, claiming perjured testimony, seeking to be reinstated on paper as Duke's legal wife. A judge dismissed her case in May of that year. Her appeal was still sitting unresolved when, on October 10, 1925, James B. Duke died in his Fifth Avenue mansion. According to the Times, when Lillian learned of his death, she simply stopped eating. 12 days later, she was found in her small studio, barely conscious, having suffered a cerebral hemorrhage brought on by malnutrition. The paper noted, almost unbearably, that investigators found only 2 eggs in her apartment. She died within days. The first wife of one of the wealthiest men who ever lived starved herself to death in a rented room, a mile from the mansion she had briefly called home, mourning a man she hadn't laid eyes on in 2 decades. Duke, for his part, had already moved on. 6 months after his divorce was finalized, at a family reception in December of 1906, he met Nannerline Holt Inman, an Atlanta widow in her mid-30s, previously married to a wealthy cotton merchant who'd left her with 1 young son. The courtship lasted 8 months. They married quietly, in Brooklyn rather than Manhattan, in July of 1907, and departed almost immediately for Duke's New Jersey country estate. Nannerline was, by every account, everything Lillian hadn't been. Composed, unbothered by scandal, entirely comfortable with wealth she'd already known from her first marriage. The union was stable. It does not appear in any surviving record to have been especially warm. In 1912, when Duke was 55 and Nannerline was around 42, their only child was born, a daughter named Doris. The relationship between mother and daughter, for the rest of both of their lives, would be defined by long stretches of cool distance and the occasional sharp fight over money, more parallel lives lived under the same roofs than any real closeness. Duke's relationship with his stepson was reportedly just as cold. The boy had no interest in the tobacco fortune, said so openly, and eventually died in 1954, after decades adrift through failed marriages and substance abuse. While all of this was unfolding, Duke had already begun assembling the second great fortune of his life, one that had nothing to do with tobacco at all. The story, fittingly for a man who built his first empire on a chance encounter with a machine inventor, begins with a house call. A New York doctor who'd grown up in the North Carolina Piedmont visited Duke on a medical matter sometime in the early 1900s, and once the appointment was finished, spent the rest of the visit describing the hydroelectric potential locked up in the Catawba River back home. Duke was already watching his brother Benjamin's textile mills spreading across the Piedmont, and he understood immediately that cheap, reliable power was the one thing holding the entire regional economy back. In 1905, the small power company already operating on the river was reorganized into the Southern Power Company, with Duke as principal investor and a young engineer named William States Lee designing something genuinely new in American utility history. Not isolated power plants serving single cities, but an interconnected system of dams strung along the entire river, so that if one station failed, the others could pick up the slack. Duke ran the electricity business exactly the way he'd run tobacco: undercut the price, make it cheap enough that customers came running, and let the competition wither. It worked. Textile mills poured into the Piedmont, chasing power rates nobody else in the region could match. By 1924, the company was renamed Duke Power in recognition of the man now steering it, supplying electricity to over 300 cotton mills and countless towns across the Carolinas, becoming the largest electric utility in the entire Southeast. Its modern descendant, Duke Energy, today serves more than 8 million customers. And then, in the final year of his life, Duke built the third and final piece of his legacy. Not a company this time, but a permanent, self-perpetuating machine for giving money away. In December of 1924, in his attorney's New York office, he signed the indenture creating the Duke Endowment, seeded with $40 million in stock and property. The money was carved up by percentage, a third to a university, a third to hospitals across the Carolinas, slices to orphanages, rural churches, and several colleges, including a historically black institution in Charlotte. And buried in the fine print was one hard condition. The small Methodist college in Durham that his father had helped bring to that city decades earlier had exactly 3 months to rename itself Duke University in honor of Washington Duke, or the money wouldn't come. The trustees voted unanimously to accept. Within a year, new buildings were rising on land his family's fortune had bought. 10 months after signing that indenture, on October the 10th, 1925, James Buchanan Duke, died of pneumonia in his Fifth Avenue mansion, 68 years old, leaving a fortune, reported around the world at roughly $100 million, in trust for a 12-year-old girl who would grow up to be one of the most famous heiresses in American history. It's worth sitting with the full arc of this story for a moment, because it really is a complete circle. It begins in 1865 with a defeated man walking 135 miles home from a prison camp, carrying nothing he could legally call his own. It ends 60 years later with his son's name carved permanently into a university, an electric utility, a charitable foundation, and one of the longest, most consequential antitrust rulings an American court has ever issued. In between lies a story that has almost nothing to do with hard work and thrift, and almost everything to do with secret contracts, manufactured competition, farmers burning warehouses in protest, factory floors segregated by race, a discarded first wife who starved herself to death, and a family willing to erase its own history of slaveholding to protect a founding myth about a walk home and a blind mule. Empires, it turns out, don't always announce themselves with gunfire. Sometimes they just show up quietly, with better lawyers, and a 10-cent discount nobody else was allowed to know about. That's the story of a family that built one of the largest fortunes in American history without ever needing to fire a single shot. Because in the right hands, paperwork can do everything a gun can do, quieter and with better public relations. If this kind of story interests you, empires, monopolies, and the families who ran them like syndicates long before anyone used that word, subscribe to Brand Ancestry, because this is exactly the kind of history we dig into every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.